The bucket slipped from Nora Dalton's frozen fingers for the third time that morning, clattering against the ice-rimmed stones of Silver Creek, and she knew with absolute certainty that if she had to make this brutal journey one more winter, something inside her would break, just as surely as the thin layer of ice she shattered with each dip of her pail. The Wyoming Territory stretched endless and unforgiving around her family's isolated homestead in the winter of 1884, and the creek lay a quarter-mile downhill from the small cabin where her father lay dying, where her younger brother tried his best to keep the fire going, and where the water barrels stood empty more often than full because this walk, this terrible frozen walk, was slowly killing her too. She was 22 years old, and her hands were those of a woman twice her age. The wind cut through her wool coat like it was made of paper, and her boots, patched and repatched, leaked ice water that numbed her toes until she could barely feel them. Nora bent again, forced her stiff fingers to grip the bucket handle, and dunked it into the creek where she had broken through the ice. The water was so cold it burned, and when she lifted the full bucket, her shoulders screamed in protest. This was her fourth trip today. She would need to make 2 more before sunset. The Dalton homestead sat on 160 acres of land her father had claimed 5 years ago, full of hope and ambition. They had built the cabin on the high ground, good for avoiding spring floods, but terrible for water access. Her mother had died 3 years back from pneumonia, caught after too many trips to this very creek in weather just like this. Now her father, Samuel Dalton, lay in his bed with the wasting sickness, growing thinner each day, and Nora carried the weight of keeping them all alive. She was halfway up the slope when she heard the horse. Nora turned, water sloshing over the bucket's rim and instantly freezing on her skirt, and saw a rider approaching from the east. Her heart hammered, not entirely from fear, but from the learned caution of a woman alone in isolated country. She set down the bucket and waited, her hand moving instinctively to the knife she kept at her belt. The rider was a cowboy. That much was clear from 50 yards away. He sat his horse like he had been born in the saddle, and as he drew closer, she could make out more details. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and a hat pulled low against the wind. His horse was a sturdy roan, well kept despite the harsh weather. When he was close enough, he pulled up and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, miss," he said, and his voice was deep, roughened by cold and wind but not unkind. "Name's Jacob Thorne. I am looking for the old mining road that used to run through these parts. Think I got myself turned around in this weather." Nora studied him with the careful assessment of someone who had learned not to trust too easily. He looked to be in his late 20s, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and eyes that were a startling clear gray. His face was weathered but honest, and there was something in his expression that was more concerned than threatening. Still, she kept her distance. "Mining road's 2 miles north," she said, pointing. "You will hit it if you follow the ridge line." Jacob nodded, but his eyes had moved from her face to the bucket at her feet, then traced the path back down to the creek, then up the long slope toward the cabin that was just visible in the distance. She saw something shift in his expression, a tightening around his eyes that might have been sympathy or understanding or both. "That's a long haul," he said quietly, "especially in this cold." "It is what it is," Nora replied, her voice harder than she meant it to be. She did not need pity from strangers, no matter how kind their eyes were. "Thank you for stopping, Mr. Thorne, but I have work to do." She bent to pick up the bucket, and pain shot through her lower back so sharply that she gasped before she could stop herself. When she straightened, gritting her teeth against the spasm, Jacob had dismounted and was standing closer, his hand half raised as if to help, but stopping short of actually touching her. "How many times a day do you make this trip?" he asked. "That is none of your concern," Nora said, but the words came out weary rather than sharp. "I manage just fine." "I did not say you did not," Jacob replied. His gray eyes held hers steadily. "But that does not mean it is not hard. How many times?" Something in his tone, that lack of condescension, that simple, straightforward acknowledgement, made her answer honestly. 6, usually. 8 if we are washing or cooking something that needs more water. 4 in winter, because I cannot make the trip as often. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, looking again between the creek and the distant cabin. "You live up there? Just you?" "My father and younger brother," Nora said. She picked up the bucket, and this time she managed not to show the pain. "My father is ill. Thomas, my brother, He is only 14, too young to make this trip as often as needed, and he is needed at the house to tend the animals and keep the fire going. And you do this every day, in this cold. It was not a question, but Nora nodded anyway. She did not know why she was still standing here talking to this stranger. There was something about him that made her want to stay, want to talk, want to not be alone for just a few more minutes. But the sun was climbing, and she had work to do, and her father would need his medicine soon. "I should go," she said. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Thorne, but truly I am managing." "Hold on," Jacob said as she started to turn away. "Just hold on a minute. That cabin up there, it is on high ground, right? Good drainage, I imagine. Not much risk of flooding?" "Yes," Nora said slowly, not understanding where he was going with this. "And the creek, it runs year-round? Does not dry up in summer?" "It has never gone dry in the 5 years we have been here." Jacob nodded, and she could see him thinking, his eyes moving over the landscape with the assessing gaze of someone who understood land and water and distance. "What if you did not have to make this walk anymore?" Nora laughed, and it came out bitter. "Unless you can make it rain inside my house, Mr. Thorne, I do not see how that would be possible." "Not rain," Jacob said, and now there was something in his voice, something excited and alive. "A pipeline, wooden pipes fitted tight and sealed with pitch. Run them from the creek straight up to your cabin. The water would flow on its own if we angle it right, use gravity to our advantage. You would have water right there at your house. No more hauling buckets." For a moment, Nora could only stare at him. The idea was so outlandish, so impossible, that she could not quite process it. "That is insane," she said finally. "Do you have any idea how much work that would be? How much that would cost?" "A lot of work," Jacob agreed, "but not impossible. I have seen it done before, smaller scale, at a ranch I worked down in Colorado. Rancher there ran pipes from a spring to his house and barn. Worked perfectly. And as for cost, well, the materials are not that expensive if you know where to look and how to do the work yourself." "And why," Nora said slowly, "would you care about any of this? You were just passing through, looking for a mining road." Jacob was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was honest in a way that made her chest tighten. "Because I know what it is like to watch someone work themselves to death trying to keep a place running. I watched my mother do it after my father died. I was too young to help much, and by the time I was old enough, she was already gone, wore herself out hauling water and wood and everything else a ranch needs." He met her eyes. "I see you making this walk, and I see her. And I think if someone had helped her, if someone had made things even a little bit easier, maybe she would still be here." The wind howled around them, but Nora barely felt the cold anymore. She looked at this stranger, this cowboy who had wandered into her life out of nowhere, and saw the grief in his eyes, old but still present, and the determination that came from not wanting to see that same story play out again. "You do not even know me," she said softly. "No," Jacob agreed, "but I would like to, and in the meantime, I would like to help, if you will let me." Nora wanted to say no, wanted to tell him that they did not need charity, that they could manage on their own, that accepting help from a stranger was foolish and dangerous and not what strong, independent homesteaders did. But her back ached, her hands were bleeding from the cold and the rope handles of the buckets, and the thought of not having to make this walk anymore, the sheer impossible relief of that idea, made her want to weep. "I cannot pay you," she said finally. "We barely have enough to get through the winter as it is." "I am not asking for payment," Jacob said. "Just let me help. I will need a place to stay while I work on it, if that is all right. I can sleep in a barn or shed, does not need to be fancy, and I will pull my weight with other chores, will not be a burden on your supplies." Nora looked at him for a long moment, weighing the risk against the desperate, aching hope that was growing in her chest. Finally, she nodded. "We have a small barn. It is not much, but it is dry and out of the wind. You can stay there. But, Mr. Thorne, if this is some kind of trick, if you mean us any harm—" "It is not, and I do not," Jacob said firmly. "You have my word, Miss Dalton. I am just a cowboy who knows how to work with his hands and does not like seeing good people suffer when there is something that can be done about it." Nora picked up her bucket again, and this time, when Jacob reached for it, she let him take it from her. They walked up the slope together, the cowboy leading his horse with one hand and carrying her water bucket with the other. and Nora tried to remember the last time someone had helped her with anything, tried to remember what it felt like to not carry every burden alone. She could not remember. It had been too long. The cabin was small but well built. Solid logs chinked tight against the wind. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and as they approached, the door opened and a boy stuck his head out. Thomas had their mother's blonde hair and their father's blue eyes, and he looked alarmed to see his sister arriving with a strange man. "Nora!" he called, his hand moving to something behind the door, probably the rifle they kept there. "It is all right, Thomas," Nora called back. "This is Mr. Thorne. He is going to help us with something. I will explain inside." Thomas did not look convinced, but he stepped back and let them enter. The cabin's interior was dim and warm, heated by the fire crackling in the stone fireplace. There was a main room with a table and chairs, a cook stove, and shelves lined with dishes and supplies. 2 doors led off to small bedrooms. It was sparse but clean, everything in its place, the home of people who took care with what little they had. Jacob set the water bucket down near the door and removed his hat. From one of the bedrooms came the sound of coughing, deep and wet, and Nora's expression tightened. "I need to check on my father," she said. "Thomas, can you show Mr. Thorne where the barn is? He will be staying there while he works on a project for us." Thomas looked at his sister like she had grown a second head, but he nodded. "Yes, all right. Come on then." After they left, Nora went into her father's room. Samuel Dalton lay in the narrow bed, covered with every quilt and blanket they owned. He had once been a large man, strong and barrel-chested, but the sickness had whittled him down to bones and papery skin. His eyes, still bright with intelligence despite his failing body, fixed on his daughter as she entered. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice thin and rasping. "A cowboy named Jacob Thorne," Nora said, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. She poured water from a pitcher into a cup and helped her father drink. "He says he can build us a pipeline from the creek to the house. So, I would not have to haul water anymore." Samuel's eyebrows rose. "That is quite an offer from a stranger. What does he want in return?" "He says nothing, just a place to stay while he works." Nora smoothed the blankets absently. "I know it sounds too good to be true, Papa, but I looked at him and I believed him. He lost his mother to this kind of work. I think he genuinely wants to help." Her father was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those sharp eyes that still missed nothing. "You be careful, Nora girl. Not all men who seem kind really are." "I know, Papa. I will be careful. But if he really can do this, if we really could have water at the house—" She trailed off, not needing to finish. Her father knew what the water hauling cost her, how it was slowly breaking her down. "All right," Samuel said finally, "but you keep that knife of yours close. And you make sure Thomas knows to watch out, too. First sign of trouble, you send him packing." "I will," Nora promised. She gave her father his medicine, a bitter tonic from the doctor in town that did not seem to do much good, but was all they could afford, and then left him to rest. When she came back out, Thomas had returned and was hovering near the fireplace, his arms crossed and his expression wary. At 14, he was trying hard to be the man of the house, and Nora loved him fiercely for it, even as she wished he could still just be a boy. "You really trust him?" Thomas asked without preamble. "I do not know him well enough to trust him completely," Nora said honestly. "But yes, I believe he means what he says. And Thomas, if he really can do this, it would change everything. I could spend more time helping Papa, more time with the garden in summer, more time on all the 100 other things that need doing. We could actually get ahead instead of just barely surviving." Thomas nodded slowly. "All right, but I am keeping the rifle loaded just in case." "Good," Nora said. "That is smart." Over the next few days, Jacob Thorne proved himself to be a man of his word. He rose before dawn and worked until after dark, and in between, he made himself genuinely useful around the homestead. He chopped wood without being asked, repaired a broken fence that Nora had not had time to fix, and even helped Thomas with the handful of cattle and chickens they kept. And in between all of that, he worked on the pipeline. The first day he spent walking the route from the creek to the cabin over and over, making notes, driving stakes into the ground to mark the path. The second day, he rode into town and came back with a wagon full of materials: boards, pitch, tools, lengths of metal pipe for the crucial connections. Nora tried to ask him how much it had cost, tried to insist that they would pay him back somehow, but he waved her off. "I had money saved," he said simply. "Was planning to buy into a ranch somewhere, but that can wait. This is more important." On the third day, he started building. Nora watched when she could, fascinated despite herself by the way he worked. He cut the boards into long sections, hollowed them out with careful precision, fitted them together with joints that locked tight. He sealed every seam with hot pitch, testing and retesting to make sure there would be no leaks. It was slow, painstaking work, and he did it with a focus and dedication that made Nora's throat tight. She still made her trips to the creek because they still needed water and the pipeline was not finished, but now Jacob often walked down with her, carrying the buckets back up the slope while she walked beside him with empty hands. It felt strange, almost wrong, to make the trip without the weight of the water dragging at her shoulders. But it also felt like breathing after being underwater for too long. They talked during those walks. Jacob told her about his life, how he had grown up on a ranch in Colorado, how he had left after his mother died because he could not bear to stay in the place where she had worked herself to death. He had spent the last 8 years drifting, working as a ranch hand, as a trail driver, as a hired gun when times were desperate. Though he said he had never liked that work, he was looking for a place to settle, he said, somewhere he could put down roots and build something that mattered. Nora told him about her own life, about growing up in St. Louis and how her father had gotten the wanderlust after her mother's family had rejected him for not being successful enough. They had come west with such hope, such certainty that they could make a better life, and they had for a while. The first 2 years had been good, but then her mother had died, and then her father had gotten sick, and the dream had curdled into a daily fight for survival. "Do you regret it?" Jacob asked one day as they climbed the slope together, him carrying 2 full buckets as if they weighed nothing. "Coming west, I mean." Nora thought about it. "No," she said finally. "It has been hard, harder than I ever imagined anything could be, but I am stronger for it. I know what I am capable of now. I know I can survive almost anything. That is worth something." Jacob looked at her with such admiration in his gray eyes that she felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the freezing wind. "You are remarkable," he said quietly. "I hope you know that." She did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, but his words stayed with her, warming her from the inside out. As the days passed and the pipeline grew longer, stretching from the creek up toward the cabin in a long wooden line, Nora found herself looking forward to Jacob's presence in a way that had nothing to do with the pipeline and everything to do with the man himself. He made her laugh with stories from his years of drifting. He listened when she talked, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak. He was patient with Thomas, teaching the boy how to work with wood and tools, treating him like a young man rather than a child. And he was kind to her father, sitting with Samuel in the evenings and playing cards or chess, giving the dying man someone new to talk to. "I like him," Samuel told Nora one night after Jacob had gone back out to the barn. "He is a good man, hard to find these days." "He is," Nora agreed softly. Her father gave her a long look. "You be careful with your heart, daughter. Good man or not, he is a drifter. He will move on when the work is done." Nora nodded, but privately she wondered if that was really true. Because the way Jacob looked at her sometimes, the way he found excuses to stand close to her, the way his hand would linger when he passed her something, all of that spoke of a man who was in no hurry to leave. 3 weeks into the project, a massive blizzard hit. The snow came down so thick and fast that visibility dropped to mere feet, and the wind howled like a living thing trying to tear the cabin apart. They brought Jacob in from the barn, not willing to risk him freezing to death in the night, and he slept on the floor near the fireplace, wrapped in blankets. The storm lasted 2 days. They were trapped inside, the 4 of them in the small cabin, and Nora learned things about Jacob that she might never have discovered otherwise. She learned that he could sing, his deep voice carrying old ballads that her mother used to sing. She learned that he could cook, not fancy, but good solid food, and that he insisted on helping with every chore. She learned that he was scared of spiders, which made Thomas laugh for the first time in months when a small one dropped from the rafters and Jacob yelped and jumped back. And she learned, watching him play chess with her father and joke with her brother and help her with the endless small tasks of keeping a household running, that she was falling in love with him. It should have been terrifying. She barely knew him. He had only been here 3 weeks, but there was something about Jacob Thorne that felt right in a way nothing else ever had. He fit into her life like he had always been meant to be there, like the missing piece she had not known she was looking for. On the second night of the storm, after Thomas had gone to bed and her father was sleeping, and it was just the two of them sitting by the fire, Jacob said quietly, "I need to tell you something, Nora." Her heart clenched. This was it, she thought. He was going to tell her he was leaving, that the pipeline was almost done, and he would be moving on, and she would have to smile and thank him and pretend her heart was not breaking. "All right," she said, keeping her voice steady. Jacob stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking. "When I stopped and asked you for directions that day, I was not really lost. I was looking for the mining road. That part was true. But I had a pretty good idea where it was. I stopped because I saw you struggling with that bucket, and I could not just ride past. I have been drifting for 8 years, Nora, and in all that time, I have never felt like I belonged anywhere. But being here, working on this project, spending time with you and Thomas and your father, this is the first time I have felt like I am home, and I do not want to leave. Not when the pipeline is done. Not ever." Nora's breath caught. Jacob, he turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her mouth go dry. "I know I do not have much to offer. I have some money saved, enough to buy a small piece of land maybe, or to help build up this homestead if that is what you wanted. I can work, I can build things, I can protect what is mine. And Nora, if you will have me, I would like you to be mine. I would like to stay here and court you properly and, if you will allow it, marry you someday. I would like to help you build the life you deserve, the one you have been fighting so hard for all on your own." Tears were streaming down Nora's face before she even realized she was crying. "You want to stay? Here? With us?" "With you," Jacob said firmly. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. "I am in love with you, Nora Dalton. I think I have been since that first day when you looked at me with such fierce pride and determination, even though you were clearly in pain. You are the strongest person I have ever met, and the kindest, and the most beautiful, and I do not want to spend another day of my life without you in it." Nora could not speak. The words stuck in her throat, tangled up with hope and fear and a joy so intense it was almost painful. So, instead of speaking, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, her lips barely brushing his. But then Jacob made a low sound in his throat and pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something fierce and claiming and full of all the loneliness and longing they had both been carrying for so long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nora rested her forehead against his and whispered, "I love you too. I was so afraid you would leave when the pipeline was finished. I do not know what I would have done." "You would have survived," Jacob said, cupping her face in his hands. "Because that is what you do. But you do not have to just survive anymore, Nora. We can build something real together. We can thrive." They sat together by the fire until long after the logs had burned down to embers, making plans and promises and dreaming of a future that finally felt possible. The storm cleared and work on the pipeline resumed. Now, though, everything felt different. Jacob was not a stranger helping out anymore. He was Nora's suitor, and everyone knew it. Thomas was delighted, having grown genuinely fond of Jacob over the past weeks. Samuel was more reserved, but clearly pleased, and he told Nora privately that he could die happy, knowing she would not be alone. "Do not talk like that, Papa," Nora said. But they both knew the truth. Samuel was fading fast. The best they could hope for was that he would live long enough to see them married. 4 weeks after Jacob had first arrived, the pipeline was complete. Nora stood in the cabin and watched, her heart in her throat, as Jacob opened the valve he had installed at the creek. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then there was a gurgling sound, and water began to flow from the pipe he had run into the cabin, spilling into the basin they had set up to catch it. It worked. After all those years of hauling water in the freezing cold, wearing herself down to nothing, they had running water right in their home. Nora pressed her hands to her mouth and wept. Jacob came to stand beside her, his arm going around her shoulders, and she turned into his chest and sobbed while he held her and murmured comforting words. Thomas whooped with joy and ran to get their father, and Samuel Dalton, weak as he was, made his way out of the bedroom to see this miracle with his own eyes. "Well, I will be damned," Samuel breathed, watching the water flow. He looked at Jacob with shining eyes. "You did it, son. You really did it." "We did it," Jacob said. It was a team effort. That night, they celebrated with the best meal they could manage, and afterward, Samuel called Nora and Jacob into his room. "I do not have much time left," he said without preamble, his voice wheezing and thin. "We all know it, so let us not pretend otherwise. Jacob, you have asked my permission to court my daughter, and I have given it. But I would like to ask something of you now. Marry her soon. Do not wait. I would like to see it before I go." "Papa," Nora protested, but Jacob squeezed her hand. "I would marry her tomorrow if she will have me," Jacob said steadily. "I do not need a long engagement, Samuel. I know what I want, and I know she is it." Samuel looked at Nora. "Daughter, what do you say?" Nora looked between the two men, both of whom she loved, and made her decision. "Yes," she said. "Let us do it soon." They were married a week later by the circuit preacher who rode through once a month. It was a simple ceremony in the cabin, with Thomas as witness and Samuel watching from his bed, too weak to stand but alert and smiling. Nora wore her mother's best dress, altered to fit her, and Jacob wore a new shirt he had bought in town. They exchanged vows and rings, simple gold bands that Jacob had purchased with the last of his savings, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed her with such tenderness that Nora felt like she might float away. Samuel Dalton died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep. They buried him on the hill overlooking the homestead, and Nora stood between her new husband and her brother and wept for the father she had loved and the life he had tried so hard to give them. But even in her grief, she felt the solid strength of Jacob beside her, and she knew she would be all right. They would all be all right. The first year of their marriage was hard, but good. They worked the homestead together, expanding the garden, increasing their livestock, making improvements to the cabin and barn. Jacob proved to be everything Nora could have hoped for in a husband. He was hard-working and patient, kind and steady. He treated Thomas like a younger brother, teaching him everything he knew about ranching and farming and surviving in this harsh land. And he loved Nora with a fierce devotion that still took her breath away. The pipeline that had brought them together continued to be a miracle. No more did Nora have to make that brutal journey to the creek. The water flowed clean and cold right into their home, and every time she used it, she thought of the day Jacob had stopped to help a struggling woman and changed all their lives forever. In the spring of their second year together, Nora discovered she was pregnant. She told Jacob one evening after supper, nervous despite herself, and watched his face transform with joy. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, and then set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "We are having a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Nora, we are having a baby." Thomas, now 16 and growing into a capable young man, was equally excited at the prospect of becoming an uncle. They spent the summer preparing, building a cradle, setting aside supplies, making room in their lives for this new person who would join them. Their son was born on a cold November morning, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. They named him Samuel Jacob Thorne, after both his grandfather and his father, and from the moment Nora held him, she knew that every hard thing she had ever endured had been worth it to arrive at this moment. Jacob was a devoted father. He would stay up all night with the baby when he was fussy, walking the floor and singing the old ballads in his deep voice. He changed diapers and helped with feedings and looked at his son with such love that Nora sometimes felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it all. As the years passed, their homestead prospered. They added on to the cabin, building more rooms as their family grew. 2 years after Samuel was born, they welcomed a daughter, whom they named Clara after Nora's mother. Then another son, Michael. Then twin girls, Anna and Elizabeth. Their family grew, and so did their landholdings as they carefully saved and eventually purchased the adjoining property. Jacob's pipeline became famous in the area. Other homesteaders came from miles around to see it and to ask Jacob to build similar systems for them. He did, charging a fair price, and the income from that work combined with their farming and ranching allowed them to become genuinely comfortable, no longer just surviving, but thriving. Thomas grew up and eventually married a school teacher who came west from Ohio, a smart, pretty woman named Margaret. They built a house on the far side of the property, close enough to help out, but far enough to have their own space. Thomas proved to have a talent for breeding cattle, and his herd became known throughout Wyoming for its quality. Through it all, through the hard winters and the dry summers, through the births and the occasional losses, through the daily work of building a life, Nora and Jacob's love deepened and strengthened. They had been forged together in struggle and had chosen each other every day since, and that foundation proved unshakable. On their 10th anniversary, Jacob surprised Nora by taking her to the place where they had first met, down by Silver Creek. It was summer now, and the creek burbled cheerfully in the sunshine, nothing like the frozen barrier it had been that winter day. They stood together on the bank, holding hands, and Jacob said, "Do you remember what you said to me that first day, when I asked if you regretted coming west?" "I said no," Nora replied. "I said it had been hard, but that I was stronger for it." "You were right," Jacob said. "But I want you to know, Nora, that you do not have to be that strong anymore, not alone. Whatever comes, we face it together. That is what the pipeline really represents, I think. Not just water flowing to a house, but two people choosing to build something together, to make each other's burdens lighter, to create something that will last." Nora turned to face her husband, this man who had stopped on a frozen day to help a stranger and had stayed to build a life. His dark hair was touched with gray now at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. But to her, he was just as handsome as he had been that first day. "I love you, Jacob Thorne," she said. "Thank you for seeing me that day. Thank you for stopping. Thank you for staying." "I love you, Nora Thorne," he replied, "and I would stop 1,000 times, would build 1,000 pipelines, would do anything at all if it meant I got to spend my life with you." They kissed there by the creek, the same creek that had once been such a burden and was now just another part of the landscape, tamed and useful, and no longer something to fear. And then they walked back up the slope together, hand in hand, toward the home they had built and the life they had created, and the future that stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility and love. The years continued to roll past in the way that years do, each one adding its own joys and sorrows to the tapestry of their lives. Samuel grew into a tall, serious boy who loved working with his hands just like his father. He learned the craft of building pipelines and helped Jacob with the projects for neighboring homesteads. And by the time he was 16, he was as skilled as his father at the work. Clara became a gentle, thoughtful girl who loved reading and learning, and Nora taught her everything she knew about medicine and herbs and tending the sick. Michael was wild and adventurous, always pushing boundaries, and more than once Jacob had to ride out to find him when he wandered too far from home. The twins, Anna and Elizabeth, were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into mischief that usually ended with everyone laughing despite themselves. The homestead continued to grow and prosper. They built a proper barn to replace the old one, added a smokehouse and a root cellar, expanded their livestock operations. Jacob's reputation as a builder and engineer spread, and he was consulted on projects as far away as Cheyenne. But he never took work that would keep him away from home for more than a few days. Family came first, always. When Samuel was 18, he announced that he wanted to study engineering formally. There was a school in Denver that was accepting students, and he desperately wanted to go. It was the first time one of their children wanted to leave the homestead, and Nora felt the bittersweet ache of watching her baby grow up and away. But she and Jacob encouraged him, scraped together the tuition money, and sent him off with their blessing and their love. Clara, at 16, surprised everyone by announcing that she wanted to be a doctor. It was an audacious dream for a woman in 1900, but Nora and Jacob supported her completely. She went east to one of the few medical schools that would accept female students, and her letters home were full of excitement and determination and stories of all she was learning. Michael, true to his wild nature, became a scout and guide, leading expeditions into the mountains and living more outdoors than in. The twins married brothers from a neighboring ranch and stayed close to home, their combined families creating a sprawling, joyful chaos of children and laughter. Thomas and Margaret had 4 children of their own, and the extended family gatherings were loud, messy, wonderful affairs that filled the house to bursting. Nora would stand in the middle of it all sometimes, watching her children and grandchildren and marvel at how different her life had turned out from what she had once expected. That young woman hauling water from the frozen creek felt like a different person, someone from a story rather than her own memory. But the story was real, and the evidence of it was all around her. The pipeline still ran from creek to house, maintained carefully over the years, still providing water as reliably as it had that first miraculous day. Jacob had added to it over time, running branches to the barn and to Thomas's house, creating a whole network that served their expanded homestead. Other families throughout Wyoming and beyond had similar systems now, all inspired by what Jacob had built here. On a warm summer evening in 1905, Nora and Jacob sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the mountains. They were in their 40s now, not young anymore, but not old either, still strong and healthy and deeply in love. Their children were grown and scattered but connected, coming home regularly, bringing grandchildren who adored their Grandpa Jacob and Grandma Nora. "Do you ever think about that day?" Nora asked quietly. "The day we met?" "Every single day," Jacob replied, reaching over to take her hand. "Best decision I ever made, stopping to talk to you." "Best decision I ever made was letting you stay," Nora said. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You know, I used to think about my mother sometimes, when I was hauling that water. I understood why she had worn herself out. It was not just the physical work, though that was brutal. It was the feeling of being trapped, of knowing you would have to do this same hard thing day after day with no end in sight. That kind of hopelessness grinds you down even more than the labor. But you never lost hope," Jacob said. "Even when I met you, exhausted and in pain, and clearly at the end of your rope, you still had that fire in your eyes. That is what I fell in love with first, I think. That absolute refusal to give up." Nora smiled. "I had to refuse. Thomas and Papa needed me. But Jacob, I was so tired. If you had not come along when you did, I do not know how much longer I could have kept going." "Good thing I was lost then," Jacob said with a smile. "You were not lost," Nora reminded him. "You stopped because you saw someone who needed help, and you could not ride past. That is who you are, Jacob Thorne. That is who you have always been." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Finally, Jacob said, "I have been thinking about something. We have done well here, built a good life. The children are settled, and Thomas is more than capable of running the ranching operation. What would you say to doing some traveling? We could go see Samuel in Denver, visit Clara in New York, maybe even take a trip out to California, see the ocean." Nora turned to look at her husband, surprise and delight blooming in her chest. "Really? You would want to do that?" "I would want to do anything with you," Jacob said simply. "We have worked hard all our lives, Nora. We have earned a little adventure, do not you think?" "Yes," Nora said, laughing. "Yes, I think we have." So they did travel, taking their first real vacation in over 20 years. They visited Samuel in Denver and marveled at the city he lived in, so different from their rural homestead. They went to New York and watched Clara graduate from medical school, bursting with pride as she walked across the stage to receive her degree. They made it to California and stood on the beach, holding hands and letting the waves wash over their feet. And Nora thought about how far she had come from that frozen creek in Wyoming. But as wonderful as the travel was, they were both eager to get home. The homestead was where they belonged, where their roots went deep into the Wyoming soil. They arrived back to a huge family gathering, everyone coming home to welcome them back. And Nora stood in the middle of her family and felt complete. More years passed. Samuel graduated from engineering school and returned to Wyoming, bringing with him a wife, a smart woman from Denver named Catherine. He started his own engineering firm in Cheyenne, specializing in water systems, and the work that Jacob had started decades ago with a simple pipeline now spread throughout the state and beyond. Clara opened a medical practice in a small town 30 miles away, one of the first female doctors in Wyoming, and became beloved by her patients. Michael settled down somewhat, marrying a woman as adventurous as he was, and together they ran a guide service that brought visitors from all over the country to experience the wild beauty of Wyoming. Jacob and Nora became grandparents many times over, and eventually great-grandparents. Their house was always full of children, and Jacob built swings and toys and all manner of things to delight them. Nora told them stories about the old days, about hauling water from the creek and meeting their grandfather, and the children would listen with wide eyes, unable to imagine a time before the pipeline, a time when Grandma Nora had to work so hard just to get water. On their 30th anniversary, the family threw them a huge celebration. Everyone came home, 3 generations gathering to honor the couple who had built the foundation on which they all stood. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and tears, and through it all, Jacob and Nora sat side by side, their hands clasped together, marveling at what they had created. Thomas, now a successful rancher with grandchildren of his own, stood up to speak. "I was 14 when Jacob came to us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I remember being suspicious of him at first, protective of my sister. But I watched him build that pipeline, watched him work day after day in the freezing cold, never complaining, never asking for anything in return. And I realized he was not just building a water system. He was building a future, our future. Everything we have, everything we are, it all started with that simple act of kindness. Jacob saw someone who needed help, and he helped. And in doing so, he changed all of our lives." There was not a dry eye in the room by the time Thomas sat down. Samuel stood next, talking about how his father's work had inspired his own career, how the principles Jacob had taught him about engineering and about life had shaped the man he had become. Clara spoke about how, watching her mother's strength and her father's compassion, had given her the courage to pursue medicine, even when everyone told her it was impossible for a woman. One by one, children and grandchildren stood and shared what Jacob and Nora meant to them, how their love story had given them all a model to aspire to. When it was finally Nora's turn to speak, she stood and looked around at all these people, all this love, and could barely find the words. "When I was young," she said finally, "hauling water from that creek day after day, I used to pray for someone to help me. I prayed for relief, for something to change, for a miracle. And then one day, a cowboy stopped to ask for directions, and my prayer was answered. But the miracle was not the pipeline, though that changed my life. The miracle was Jacob himself. The miracle was being seen and valued and loved. The miracle was building a partnership where we make each other stronger, where we face everything together. That is what I want you all to take from our story. Find someone who sees you, who values you, who will build alongside you. Find someone who makes your burdens lighter and your joys deeper. Find what your father and I found, and hold on to it with everything you have." Jacob stood beside her and wrapped his arm around her waist. "I am a very lucky man," he said simply. "Everything good in my life came from the decision to stop and help a beautiful woman with a bucket of water. Best decision I ever made." The celebration went late into the night, with music and dancing and stories. Nora danced with Jacob, their movements slower now, but no less graceful, still perfectly in sync after 3 decades together. She looked up at her husband, at his gray hair and lined face, and the gray eyes that still looked at her with the same love and admiration they had held that first day, and knew that she would choose him again in a heartbeat, would choose this life 1,000 times over. As they grew older, they slowed down, but never stopped. Jacob still tinkered and built, though now it was mostly toys for the great-grandchildren rather than pipelines. Nora still tended her garden and her medicines, though she had Clara helping her now and teaching a new generation. They still sat on the porch every evening and watched the sunset. They still held hands. They still loved each other with the fierce, steady devotion that had carried them through 3 decades and would carry them through whatever time they had left. On a spring morning in 1915, Jacob woke early and lay in bed, watching Nora sleep beside him. She was 62 now, her dark hair silver, her face lined with decades of living. To him, she was still the most beautiful woman in the world. He thought about that frozen day in 1884 when he had first seen her, struggling with her bucket, and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it was almost overwhelming. What if he had not stopped? What if he had just ridden past? He would have missed all of this, every single moment of joy and love and meaning that had filled the last 31 years. Nora's eyes opened, and she smiled to see him watching her. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice still soft with sleep. "Good morning, my love," Jacob replied. He reached out and brushed a strand of silver hair from her face. "Have I told you lately that you are amazing?" "Not since yesterday," Nora said, laughing. "You are falling behind, Cowboy." "I will have to remedy that," Jacob said, and then proceeded to list all the ways she was amazing, wonderful, brilliant, beautiful, until she was laughing and swatting at him and telling him to stop being ridiculous. They rose and went about their morning routine, the comfortable dance of 2 people who had spent decades learning each other's rhythms. Jacob started the fire, while Nora put on coffee. They ate breakfast together at the table Jacob had built when they were first married, now worn smooth by decades of use. They talked about their plans for the day, about the grandchildren who were coming to visit, about the new foal in Thomas's barn. After breakfast, they walked down to the creek together, something they tried to do once a week when weather permitted. The pipeline was still there, still functioning after more than 3 decades, a testament to the quality of Jacob's work. But they did not go to check on it, not really. They went because this place was sacred to them, the spot where their lives had intersected and changed forever. They stood on the bank, holding hands, and Nora said softly, "Thank you, Jacob, for everything, for stopping that day, for staying, for building a life with me, for loving me." "Thank you for letting me," Jacob replied, "for taking a chance on a drifter who showed up out of nowhere with a crazy idea, for loving me back, for making me the luckiest man alive." They walked back to the house together, up the slope that Nora had once climbed 6 or 8 times a day, with buckets of water dragging at her shoulders. Now the walk was easy, pleasant, a chance to enjoy the spring sunshine and the greening landscape. When they reached the house, there were already grandchildren arriving, running to meet them with shouts of joy, and Jacob and Nora opened their arms and their hearts and welcomed them in. That evening, after the visitors had gone and it was just the 2 of them again, they sat on the porch and watched the sun set one more time. Jacob held Nora close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, and they were quiet, content, complete. "Do you think we will get another 30 years?" Nora asked softly. "I do not know," Jacob replied honestly. "But whatever time we have, I will spend it loving you, every single day." "That is all I need," Nora said. "That is all I have ever needed." The years continued to pass, and Jacob and Nora continued to face them together. They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by 4 generations of family, all descended from the union of a homesteader's daughter and a drifting cowboy who had stopped to help. They weathered illnesses and losses, celebrated births and weddings, and through it all, their love remained the constant, the foundation on which everything else was built. When Jacob was 70, he fell ill with pneumonia one harsh winter. Nora nursed him through it with fierce determination, calling on all the medical knowledge she and Clara had accumulated over the years. For days he lay in fever, and Nora barely left his side, holding his hand and telling him he had to fight, had to come back to her, because she was not done with him yet. And Jacob, ever unable to deny her anything, recovered. "You are not getting rid of me that easily," he told her when he was finally on the mend, his voice still weak but his smile strong. "I made you a promise 31 years ago that whatever time we had, I would spend it loving you. I intend to keep that promise." 2 years later, it was Nora who fell ill. Nothing serious, the doctor said, just a bad cold. But at 64 and worn down by decades of hard living, even a cold could be dangerous. This time, it was Jacob who nursed her, who sat by her bedside and told her stories and held her hand and refused to let her go. And Nora, who had survived so much, who had fought her way through hardship and loss and pain, fought one more time and won. They were granted more years, precious years, time they spent surrounded by the family and the life they had built together. They saw great-great-grandchildren born. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1924, an event that drew family and friends from across the country. The governor of Wyoming himself sent a congratulatory letter, acknowledging Jacob's contributions to the state's water infrastructure and Nora's work in medicine and community building. But the thing they were most proud of was not the accolades or the success or the material prosperity they had achieved. It was the love that filled their home, the knowledge that every person in their family had grown up seeing what real partnership looked like, what real commitment meant. It was knowing that the decision Jacob had made on that frozen day in 1884 to stop and help had rippled out through time, creating waves of kindness and love that would continue long after they were gone. Jacob passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1927 at the age of 71, with Nora beside him holding his hand just as she had held it for 43 years. His last words were, "I love you, Nora. Thank you for the most wonderful life." And then he was gone, leaving Nora with a grief so profound she thought it might swallow her whole. But she had been strong before Jacob came, and she was strong still, even in her loss. She lived 2 more years, surrounded by family, continuing to tend her garden and her medicines, continuing to tell the story of how a cowboy had stopped one frozen day and changed everything. She spoke often of Jacob, keeping his memory alive, making sure the grandchildren and great-grandchildren knew what kind of man he had been. On a warm summer evening in 1929, Nora Thorne passed away at the age of 67, sitting on the porch she had shared with Jacob for so many years, watching the sunset one last time. She died as she had lived, with grace and strength and surrounded by love. They buried her beside Jacob on the hill overlooking the homestead, the same hill where they had buried her father 45 years earlier. The entire extended family came for the funeral, so many people that they covered the hillside, all of them there to honor the woman who had been the heart of their family. At the funeral, Samuel, now in his 40s and a respected engineer, stood and spoke about his mother. "She once told me," he said, "that the miracle was not the pipeline. The miracle was being seen and valued and loved. The miracle was partnership. My mother and father showed all of us what that looks like. They showed us that love is not just a feeling, but a choice, made every day, to build together, to support each other, to face whatever comes side by side. That is their legacy. Not the land or the money or the success, but the love. And it is a legacy I see reflected in every person here, in every marriage, every partnership, every friendship that has been shaped by their example." The years rolled on, and the homestead remained in the family, passed down through the generations. The pipeline Jacob had built still stood, maintained carefully, a physical reminder of where it all began. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued to gather there, drawn by the strength of the foundation Jacob and Nora had laid. And on the hill where they were buried, standing together for eternity as they had stood together in life, their graves were marked by a single large stone. On it was carved simply, "Jacob and Nora Thorne." He stopped to help. She let him stay. Together, they built a love that lasted forever. The story of the cowboy and the homesteader's daughter, of the pipeline built in the freezing cold, of the love that grew from a simple act of kindness, became a legend in Wyoming. It was told and retold, passed down through the family and through the community, a reminder that sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest impacts, that stopping to help a stranger can change the course of multiple lives, that love built on partnership and respect and genuine care can weather any storm and last beyond even death itself. And somewhere in the Wyoming wind, on the hill overlooking the homestead, where generations of their family still gathered, the spirits of Jacob and Nora Thorne rested together, their love story complete, their legacy secure, their happy ending earned through 4 decades of choosing each other every single day.